Welcome to the Church of God Network podcast, everybody. I am here once again with Debbie Caudle. I enjoyed the podcast episode. Her and Chantel did so much. I needed to get in on the action. Plus, there are a few things going on in my life that made Debbie the perfect person to contact for this kind of episode. So, Debbie, maybe not only welcome back to the show, but maybe tell people a little bit more about your professional background and a little bit about yourself in case they missed it the first time around.
Sure. Well, first of all, Daniel, thank you for having me. I'm always a little surprised when someone reaches out to me and says, "Can we interview you?" I don't know why, but I am.
Mhm.
I'm a licensed professional counselor and a nationally certified counselor. That sounds fancy, but basically, anybody who is a licensed therapist has probably taken the national certification exam because it's one of the exams that potentially allows you to be licensed. So it's like you get
Mhm.
double credentials for one exam. Um, but I've been doing this work since I was 24 years old because I did a year-long internship in grad school and then I graduated at 25. So I've been doing it for over 30 years, so you can start to do the math there. It's a really long time. I've done it in a few different settings. I've been in a government funded agency when I first started out. Then I went into community college settings and I worked with college age students. Then I opened my own private practice. And that was a pretty traditional practice. And then that morphed into a equine facilitated practice where we didn't put clients on horses, but we used horses in the therapy process because and we had to get trained to do that. That was a
Mhm.
special sort of certification. Horses are just big, giant, moving metaphors, so it was very powerful. Then life took another twist, and we sold our horses, sold our ranch, moved out of Wyoming, came to Texas, and I was back in an office setting again. And then I was beginning to go virtual before COVID, but then COVID really solidified that for me because it suited a lifestyle that I was looking for. It has allowed me to live internationally, although I'm back in the US now. And yeah, here we are. I'm still plugging away. I love working with people. I love working with people who want to do the work. But yeah,
Mhm.
I love being able to help people change relationships, and that's really my specialty. I don't deal in severely mentally ill people or you know, I mean that covers a whole lot of things right there. I really am very focused on relationships, helping people transform their relationship with themselves and the people around them. So yeah.
I mean, you could tell Debbie's been interviewed and done this professionally a few times. That's a really great segue. I didn't know that was your primary focus, or at least
Yeah.
your particular passion within the field, because that is what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah.
So even though I figured you would have a lot of insight, I didn't realize how much in your wheelhouse it actually was. See, for the sake of the viewer and the listener, that what motivated me to reach out to you about this episode is I have noticed over the years, and especially coincidentally lately, that there are people from the Church of God who'll go from one group to another group as a result of some sort of negative experience, some sort of disenchantment with the people in that particular organization. And it tends to, not always, but tends to be the group they grew up with. So you have a little bit maybe of a family dynamic there, but there's sort of the implicit assumption that there's an issue here that if I just go to a different group, won't be there. I just need to find the right group of people. And I've also seen that with people who have left the church entirely, that they react to something in the church, which could very well be a legitimate problem, but the implication in their actions or the what's implicit is this is wrong. This is a bad group of people. I need to find a good group of people, whether it's politics, a different religion, something like that. And I think it's the lack of recognition as well. Not only that people are people everywhere, but oftentimes when we deal with people in the church, in any context, but specifically to the church as well, that we're not actually dealing with the problem we think we're dealing with, that we have so many things under the surface, so many complexities to how we respond to things, that you might think, oh, this person's just divisive, when in reality, there's something deeper you're dealing with, and it requires sort of a us to exercise certain muscles of the conversion process to deal with. And I know you said in our planning meeting, it you have to start with, I'm responsible for me. Could you talk a little bit about just that concept?
Sure. We can't change anybody around us. No matter how hard we try, people don't change because we want them to. There are really only two reasons why people change, if you think about it: inspiration and desperation, right? We're either inspired to change by something, by an example that's been set,
Mm-hmm.
something that we've seen, something that we've read, something that we've watched, and we go, I want to be like that. Or we're desperate to change because out of fear. We're afraid that we're going to lose someone or something if we don't make that change. Those are really, it really boils down to those two reasons. So you cannot make somebody change. If you don't like something that someone is doing, no amount of begging, pleading, preaching, yelling, screaming, isolating, shunning will force that person, at least permanently. They might temporarily make some changes again out of fear,
Mm-hmm.
but it won't bring about any permanent lasting change, which means it really just boils down to, we need to focus on us. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a Matthew 7 principle, right? Stop focusing on the other person and start looking inwards. The only change we can affect in life is the change within ourselves.
Yeah,
That's
it's, I
it.
mean,
So we are responsible for us. Yes.
what you're saying, I mean, what you could really say too is conversion starts and ends with me. Like, you don't have any,
Absolutely.
we barely have um control over some of what we respond to, which we'll get into. I mean, we always have agency, but sort of
Mhm.
I'm fascinated with this concept of the extent to which we have as much control as we think we do, not just out of a sense of arrogance, like, yeah, there are certain things you just can't control, but certain things that are motivate you that you are not even consciously aware of. But
Mhm.
the you mentioned inspiration and desperation. Those coincidentally also happen to be, it seems like, the two mechanisms God uses for changing conversion as well. Ideally, it's the
Yes.
inspiration, it's God's word, it's being
Mhm.
around brethren, around people that inspire you, God's Holy Spirit. But then there's the desperation of trials and
Being
uh,
saved, right? Not going through, difficult times in the end times. You're right. I mean, that could be a whole nother podcast
mhm,
episode, I'm sure, right?
yeah.
People who are called out of desperation, fear, versus people who are inspired and truly convicted in their hearts. Yeah. Yeah. I hadn't thought about it that way when I was saying that, but you're absolutely right.
Yeah,
Yes.
and I think the there are elements of that in everyone's conversion, like moments of each. Like, sometimes it's a wake up
Absolutely.
call, sometimes it's inspiration. And the I was talking with you about this during the planning call, which is, there's a scripture in First Corinthians 6 that I had never really noticed before, and I was doing a
Mhm.
study recently, and Paul is lamenting the fact that the Corinthian church is taking lawsuits against each other to the courts. And we all know this section of scripture. And he's saying, you shouldn't do this. We're going to judge the world. We're going to judge angels. Can't you try trivial matters? And he says, the fact that there are even these lawsuits among you is a problem, is a failure. Wouldn't it just be better to be defrauded than to bring these lawsuits against each other? Like, that's such a powerful and difficult concept, that your conversion really is rooted in not only, in effect, mercy, showing mercy by not dragging this thing out, but taking all this stuff on the chin, because again, you can't control what the other person does. Yeah, you should, as brethren, be able to address these things. But if you can't, the only thing you can do is just accept being defrauded. Like, it's at that level of intensity.
Yeah. I don't think I don't think that is actually humanly possible. I think that does require God's Holy Spirit. And I speak this from both personal and professional experience. people really struggle in and out of the church with a, a desire for things to be fair. And
Hmm.
I know that's probably going to lead to another question that you have for me, but um, so how do we let go of the fairness of things? How do we let go and just, it sounds trite, let go and let God, but I mean, that is true. And I think of different situations that I'm intimately aware of where, you use the word defrauded, but I mean, where someone truly was wronged. They
Hmm.
were wronged by another member. Maybe they were even wronged by somebody in leadership. And they could have, I mean, they actually probably could have, made taken legal action.
Hmm.
And I think it requires a whole lot of humility to be able to, at the end of the day, say, I forgive that person for being imperfect. And I have suffered as a result of what that person has done. But God knows far more about this situation than I think I know. So I'm going to let him handle this.
Right.
I'm going to let him resolve this in his time. And if I have to go through some discomfort, because that discomfort might include other people maligning you or slandering you because they think they know what's happened, then so be it. That is a very difficult thing. That is a journey. Um, and I think it takes years to be able to get to that point of going, it's okay that it's not okay that it happened, but it's okay that I had to go through that.
Hmm.
So much of the time we don't really understand what God is having us learn through something really difficult until we are through it on the other side. And then we can look back and go, oh, that's why.
Right.
I
And
get
that's,
it now.
and I guess it makes me think of a couple of things. The first is what has helped me over the years in terms of that innate sense of justice or fairness that people tend to
Yeah.
have, is realizing I don't know what fairness and justice is. Like we're in the church slowly supposed to be learning what God's sense of justice is, but we in any context lack a lot of information. And so our idea of what is fair might, even if it's true given the information we have, if we're lacking information about the context of the situation, we're not going to come to a fair judgment. So the it feels like in my experience, the humility comes from trying to slowly get a more accurate understanding of yourself and your own limitations that can then be applied to other people. And like you said, it's even more than people just being imperfect. There are like real serious wrongs that people go through, and
Mhm.
the that's why we're told not to make these eternal judgments about people, because you don't know if it's, there are wheat and tares, but there's also people who are just in a different spot in the continuum of their own conversion. And if they're in a particular low spot, or if something's going on in their life, like if they're, I don't know, if their kid is deathly ill, who knows, a million different things. If their particular struggle is on a certain front and they've gone through some things in their life, people have gone through some horrible things in the church. Um, in terms of people coming in, I think we have all this kind of the widest spectrum of baggage, the same representative of all the baggage the world carries, and that affects how we interact with each other. Um, but it's the recognition that, and to your point as well, this might be a really important catalyst in my life or that person's life for serious change and the work of conversion. And who am I to complain about the occurrence when I don't have the perspective to know if this is a good or bad thing? That I might be lamenting something that's a huge blessing for one or both of us.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to go back to what you were saying about we don't have enough context. I think you used that word. We never have enough context.
Yeah.
I mean, that is
Yeah.
that is 100% true. in virtually every situation, because how can we? How
Mhm.
can we know everything that's going on in a person's life? We can't read their minds. We haven't walked in their shoes. We don't know everything about their background. We can look at a couple and go, oh, she seems like a really angry person, and he seems like a really happy-go-lucky person. It must be so difficult for him to be married to her. So we make an inference
Yeah.
based on what we see, but what we don't know is what happens behind closed doors, right? Maybe that anger is a result of how she's being treated in the marriage, but we don't see that. We only see what is presented to us, on the face of things. And that is happening all the time. I think back to times when someone has come up to me over the years and said, because this has happened a couple of times. Um, Most of the time, people don't come to you, so I have to give credit that it
Hmm.
happened at least twice. That two different people on two different occasions said, "Debbie, you hurt my feelings," and they told me what I had said or done to hurt their feelings. And I remember being so shocked that A, first of all, I didn't even remember saying that, and B, that they had inferred the meaning that they attached to that had absolutely nothing to do with what was going on in my mind at the time. And I think it just really solidified for me how much we make assumptions about what we think is going on with somebody. I just came back from the Branson Family Weekend, and I think it was Mr. Myers who gave a seminar on how when we make decisions, we either use emotion or we use logic, and both of those can get us in trouble. And there's truth in that, because I don't know if it was Mr. Myers. If it wasn't, sorry to the person who it was.
I think it might have been because I was at Winter Family Weekend. I actually still wear
Did he do the
the
same
little thing,
one?
and I think Dave Myers did the same one there.
Okay. So, and I thought, wow, I've never really thought about that. I'm very, very aware of us, making emotionally based decisions, but I never really thought about the danger of logically based decisions. But really what he's saying is very true, because both of those lead us to make inferences, right?
Hmm.
Or assumptions. We look at the evidence in front of us and we stack it together and go, it must mean this,
Hmm.
when it might not mean this at all. It might mean that. But because we are missing key information, and um, well, we're just missing key information, we draw the wrong conclusion. And
Hmm.
of course, his whole point was, if we don't make judgments based on God's truth, then we're going to get steered wrong. So, back to your whole point of, people get sideways. They get sideways over things, right? They emotionally get sideways over personality conflicts. There have been times in my life where I just didn't like somebody.
Hmm.
and and in one person's case, she's now one of my closest friends. I don't take the credit for that. I give her the credit for that. But I didn't like her because I was making inferences about the things that she was saying and doing and what they meant, and I was
Hmm.
taking them very personally, and using my own past experiences all the way back to childhood
Right.
to attach meaning to what she was doing, and drawing a conclusion. And because she kept trying to find common ground with me, we were able to push past those original assumptions, because she didn't like me initially either, but there were reasons why she kept reaching out to me. And we pushed past that, and I got to know her.
Hmm.
I got to understand her, and vice versa. And now, I mean, we're super tight. But how much of the time does that happen in the church, right? We bump up against people who think differently than us, have different backgrounds than us, they have different perspectives than us, they have personality quirks that rub us wrong, and we just stop right there.
Yeah. And the difficulty too, because the lack of information, the assumptions, just the idea that even if you're trying, because people I think oversimplify even the whole logic versus emotion thing. Like
Right.
Everyone is emotionally driven to a large extent. And yeah, you could
Yes.
employ logic to try to buttress that a bit. But like you said, if you have only 25% of the equation, yeah, your analysis might be correct under that 25%, but you're missing a whole chunk of the explanation for that situation. And it applies not only to the other person, but it applies to yourself. I mean, we don't we don't have 100% understanding, I mean, not even close, about what genetically might be at play with us or what might be at play physically on a particular day or to what extent our upbringing affected certain things with us. A lot of this stuff is unconscious. And then you're dealing with someone else who has their own unconscious issues and,
Absolutely.
and, has just learned to interpret things particular ways. You know, you talk about going to your brother or sister with an issue, and what I see often is number one, it's very sort of famously one of the least followed commands because it's extremely difficult.
Yes.
But when it becomes so complicated because the average person does not, I mean, no one, very few people like conflict, but the average person, it's like public speaking. It's such a barrier that they just like, they're not going to do it. Um, but when someone does, what's interesting is that the other person should view that as a massive opportunity because you're getting more information into your system, whether it's like at work and it's just colleagues and it's not an emotional thing, but hey, we're doing this thing wrong. When someone has the courage to give honest feedback, even if you don't agree with it, or even if it winds up being not fully accurate, it's a big help. You need that into the your system of information. But then if that person they go to winds up responding really poorly, the other person might also use that like, okay, well, I'm not going to do that anymore because that person didn't respond well, or because that person didn't, I'm going to think twice before doing it the next time. When in reality, like you said, you're responsible for you. God says to do it. You don't do it because you're going to get a response that you expect. You do that because it's the right thing to do. And I think part of navigating that is understanding what might be at play. Like I've known so many people who view personal disagreement, which raising an issue to someone else about you being wronged would rise to that level. That's personal rejection because that's how they were raised in their house. Where anytime you said no to mom or dad, or anytime you brought up something that was an issue, they took it like personal rejection and weaponized their love or affection for you in order to respond to that. So like, who knows what's motivating each person in these interactions? But in our planning call, you mentioned something really interesting about identifying our core beliefs. And it's not necessarily in our community it's a Sabbath and the holy days. That's not what we mean, but the core beliefs we sort of tell ourselves and that influence the story of our life that we tell ourselves. Can you explain more about that?
Sure. I like to use a metaphor to explain this better. I try not to use a lot of clinical jargon because what's the point of that?
Sure.
So I think of a filter in your home that has to be replaced periodically because it traps a lot of junk, right? It's meant to purify the air, but it gets dust particles and whatnot, and you have to replace it. Well, imagine that you have a filter in your brain. Like if you could screw the top of your head off, imagine right there would be a filter. And everything you've ever gone through in your life has passed through that filter. Every experience, every relationship. And so inevitably, after living a number of years, there are some things trapped in that filter, some junk that's trapped in that filter. And those are belief systems that are faulty. Or there may be an element of truth to them, but the way that we're thinking about them holds us back in some way. So, but they are core to how we identify ourselves. They are core to how we relate to the world around us. So hence the term core beliefs. So core beliefs can be completely accurate, but we can also have core beliefs that are steering us in completely wrong directions. Let me give you a really simple and fictional example. If I had a bad experience with, we'll just say, cheerleaders, if I had a bad experience with cheerleaders as a kid growing up, And I formed a core belief that cheerleaders are stuck up snobs who think they're better than everybody else. Okay. Um, that's going to stay stuck in that filter. Now, I may have completely forgotten that that's a belief in my system until something activates that belief. So now let's say I have a brand new client and it's a woman and she's the head coach, head cheerleading coach at the local university, and I don't like her. There's just something about her that's just rubbing me wrong, but I can't figure out why. And that's usually a clue that there's something stuck in that mental filter that hasn't been dealt with. So if I do the work and I start really going, yeah, Debbie, what's going on? Why are you so, harsh about this woman? She hasn't done anything to you. And I start really exploring what it is. It takes me back to, well, it's those girls that treated me poorly, and they were cheerleaders. And I'm now associating anybody with cheerleading as being, stuck up, snobby, thinking they're better than everybody else. And so I've identified that belief that's stuck in that mental filter, which allows me to do one of two things. I can go back, I can disassociate my experience with this woman from what happened in the past, and I can begin to reframe my experience with those girls. Because did I really know them? Probably not. I wasn't hanging out with them, because they didn't treat me very nicely. But I have no context for what their home life was like. I know nothing about them other than those isolated events. But because it happened maybe once or twice or three times, it reinforced that belief for me. So that's what we're talking about when we say there are these core beliefs that everything passes through that filter and tells us who we can trust or can we trust at all. That's what forms our insecurities. That's what forms our distorted thinking about situations. That's what leads us to interact with ourselves and other people in certain ways. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times we're not aware of those beliefs. And that's why we say things like, I don't know why I feel this way, or I don't know why I keep doing this. I keep having these patterns in my life playing out over and over, and I don't know why. When you say to yourself, I don't know why, almost guaranteed, there's a core belief that's driving that.
Yeah. And there was a principle that I read about these core beliefs or the functionality early on of some of these beliefs or stories we tell ourselves, that when they first develop, they have a certain functionality to maintain our survival mentally and emotionally, especially when we're young. Like if you're getting made fun of, like you said, by cheerleaders or something, and you're a kid and maybe you don't have you're not developed enough or to parse out the nuance of, okay, I don't know their home life, and it's just a reaction where I need to put blame on this other group of people so I can protect my own identity or sense of self or not get overwhelmed by it. Or even more core, you grow up in a home environment where your parents are really unhealthy and there's, fighting in the home and all kinds of issues. And maybe you internalize this, well, this must be my fault. Or they don't show love to you and it must be my fault, because the alternative is the people that you need to trust and love the most are not really capable of providing that for you, and you can't deal with that at 3 years old. So you have to construct like a reality that helps you survive. But the problem is you get to adulthood when you should be developed enough and be able to understand the nuance and reason through this thing. But now they no longer serve you. Those things that helped you survive as a kid no longer serve you, and they're also 10 times harder to get out of.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And we are wired as children for all the reasons that you just, mentioned. We absorb all parents are inconsistent to one degree or another. There's a spectrum, of course, of that, but no parent loves unconditionally 100% of the time. So the takeaway for a child, of course, is, that they have to be able to interpret that inconsistency. Daddy only loves me when my room is always clean. Mommy only loves me when I bring home, perfect grades. So what do we do with that inconsistency? Well, we absorb that, we internalize that, and we take that on as a flaw within us. And you're absolutely right. That doesn't just go away. It's stuck in that mental filter and it carries into adulthood. And it's a lens through, I'm changing metaphors here, but it's a way, it colors the way that we interact with the whole world. So I mean, this happens in the church, clearly, because as you said, the church is a microcosm of everything that's going on in the world to one degree or another. So that's why it is, bringing it back to what is our responsibility. We have to be able to say, I know there's some junk in my filter. I know that there are things that have happened to me in the past that affect the way I see people, the way I see myself, the way I see God. We can have a very transactional relationship with God too. God, I need you to do this for me because dot dot dot. Um, all our relationships are impacted by this. So that's why it's so important that we focus on ourselves instead of pointing fingers at everybody else, because everybody's got some junk in that filter. Everybody does. And there's nothing we can do about anybody else's core beliefs. But if we can be, we want everybody to be patient with us, but we have to show patience. We have to reciprocate that patience. And everybody's on their own journey. Some people have a lot more self-awareness than others. Um, it's just, I think it's just a complicated thing, interacting with people who are at different stages of understanding themselves and understanding what has shaped them and letting God's spirit change them, transform them into something much better.
Yeah. And it's the nature of the issues at play are, you know, potentially life altering to address, like the implications psychologically for us and for the people we interact with to address some of these issues are when identifying these core beliefs are not always just, it's not an intellectual pursuit. You might have to confront some things that are very unpleasant about, whether either the people that you were closest to and have this, biological, spiritual desire to love most. And you might have to think about them differently, or see yourself in the context in which you've operated for 20, 30, 60 years differently. One of the things that I do, and I've mentioned this to you before, is I buy all kinds of books that are written about the Church of God sphere from either a positive or negative perspective. And there are so many people who, as they're telling their story and they're doing the biography, they illustrate something that to the objective observer goes, oh, well, I could see there's a problem there. And, your parents did X and said this is what God's way of life was, when not only is that not true, like even the church apparatus never taught that. And when that individual, as they get older, they start blaming the church for those things or God for those things, when in reality, the blame, and blame's a tough word, but the responsibility for that is what they went through in their home. But to be empathetic to them, that's a hard thing. Like you don't want to put that on your parents or your siblings or something like that. It's easier to offload that to another group of people who you can paint with a broad brush.
Depends on who you are. Lots of people are happy to blame their parents.
Sure. Yeah, it depends. Yeah, it depends. Like maybe that's easier than understanding that your parents have issues and are have their own baggage. And my dad tells the story because he taught health for 30 plus years in inner city New York. He said during the family dynamics segment of the semester, he would ask the students who wants to be just like mom or dad. And he said only a couple people would ever raise their hand, and it would be very sheepish. And he said to the class, he goes, I have bad news. You're already just like them. and that's the truth. So sometimes even the things that might seem opposite, right? The desire to whitewash your parents' actions because you want to love them versus I'm going to blame them for everything and
Villainize them. Yeah.
It's the same thing. It's a reaction to some sort of rejection. You're already developing those habits because they put the, that's where the information in your system comes from, is your experiences. So it's such a complex issue.
Yeah.
And one of the important things is, as you mentioned, all these core beliefs very often are subconscious. Very few people
Mhm.
are telling themselves, this is why I think about this thing. This is what I think about the world.
Yeah.
At 5 years old, you're not making a conscious decision to develop these habits,
Yeah.
but bringing them into conscious awareness is so important. Could you explain not only sort of that process, but the effect of bringing these things into conscious awareness as opposed to just subconsciously driving our actions?
That's there is no sort of black and white answer here. I think what brings people to me to work, to work with me is because they've started to recognize that there's a pattern to their decision making, and their decision making, the choices they're making are getting them in trouble. Often it's like I keep picking the wrong people in my life romantically. And so what that becomes the starting point for us to be able to go, okay, what's driving that pattern, right? So I guess what I would say to people is stop and ask yourself, because to go back to the whole concept of blame, the majority of the world, and I include the church in this when I say this, the majority of people really don't want to take personal responsibility. That's human nature, and we're battling that all the time. We want to blame something or someone for the way that we think and feel and then react. It's easier that way. It's easier to say, I am the way I am because of you, because I've now absolved myself of having to do anything. You have to be the one to now change.
Mm.
Whatever you is, you might be the church, you might be my father, you might be the weather, it could be an environmental thing that's affecting, us. Um, but now I'm in this passive role, right? Just waiting, if you would just load the dishwasher right, I wouldn't be so angry. So change the way you load the dishwasher or fold the laundry or whatever. I mean, it even comes down to some of those really minute, petty things that we are wanting somebody else to do so that we can feel differently. And so most people don't want to accept personal responsibility, unfortunately. But if a person has gotten to a place in their life, I call these critical moments, these crises of truth. Okay, it's like this juncture in the road that you've been taking, and now you have this opportunity to take a different path. And what brings us there? Well, sometimes it's an internal crisis of truth. I don't like the person that I am. How did I become this way? How did I become so angry? Or how did I become so fearful? Or it's an external crisis of truth. I'm about to lose my marriage. I'm about to lose my job. Nobody talks to me at church. Whatever that external thing is, that really stops us in our tracks, and we go, I've got to do something differently. Usually, it's those moments, those crises of truth, and that happens many times in our life, that we have an opportunity to go, there's something about me that I need to figure out. Unfortunately, a lot of people, when they get to that moment, they might have a brief moment of self-reflection, and then they just keep going down the same path, right? Because change is scary, change is hard, it requires work, it might cost money, because you're not able to figure it out on your own. And so off we go down that, what I like to call the familiar path, the
Mm-hmm.
path of just making the same choices over and over. But there are the people out there who are committed and ready to start making some different choices in their lives. And those people recognize that there's something, they may not know what it is, but that there's something that they are doing that is causing this pattern in their life.
And
And
what
that's the beginning of the beginning for them.
right. And the for me, I've always, the older I've gotten, the more I've dealt with my own issues, I've come to see that, I mean, what we're talking about is addiction. It's not substance abuse necessarily, but
Right.
I see, what was it? Was it Carl Jung? So there's a famous um, psychologist who says addiction is the one common experience to mankind. And
Mhm.
I've seen that over the course of my life. And when you talk about making the same choices, not being able to change it, and then you reference, the scripture that comes to mind is when Paul talks about when you, for a moment, see yourself in a mirror and then forget your natural face.
Yeah.
It's this idea that you have a brief moment of clarity and then you fall back into the pattern, into the addiction. And I think when people talk about taking responsibility or not blaming or realizing you have to change your actions, that that can take a lot of different forms, because obviously if you're
Yeah.
dealing with an addiction, you very few people come out of those things cold turkey. They don't have the realization like, okay, well, I'm not going to respond in anger as my primary thing anymore. But what you can do is, well, I'm going to handle this differently. Even the realization that the issue is within you is a
Mhm.
level of taking responsibility, which
Yes.
is again core to what conversion is. Conversion is this process of God revealing your own mind to you over time and slowly bringing you into a place really of responsibility, because our judgment period is now in the church. Um,
Mhm.
but you you have all these individuals at varying states of this process, and because it's such a mixed bag, the idea of the change being even just your attitude towards it, even if the core issue is not changing that fast, is so important. That's why the whole rather just be defrauded or turn the other cheek,
Mhm.
or like all these things are things you can do in uh, in the moment, even while you're still addressing all these issues or dealing with someone else who's addressing their issues. But it's the aspect of it that you are in, control of, that you can
Yes.
choose to let this go. You can choose to show mercy, to yourself or to the other person for the sake of maintaining peace, and giving each other um, latitude as you navigate conversion. Because the other thing about this that was life changing for me was I heard a minister articulate some of this dynamic as well, that you mentioned the desire to want to blame others or offload blame from yourself in general. And that is the recognition that the central conflict between us and God is that we think we are God. That's what Satan rebelled against God. He thought he was capable of being God, that he should be the one ruling, and that's the
Mhm.
air of human existence. We think we should be able to govern ourselves, determine for ourselves what's good and evil, and as a
Yeah.
result, we subconsciously see ourselves as this God figure, and a God can't be wrong, because if a God's wrong, then it's not a God. We're dependent on the one who is actually God, and we have to change the way we look at ourselves in our lives, which rocks the foundation of our existence. So you're talking about the interpersonal spheres where all this comes out, and that's why we're conversions individual in nature, but we're
Mhm.
called into a body of people.
Yeah, that's what complicates it.
Mm-hmm.
We don't walk this path alone, just me and God, God and me. You know,
Yeah.
it's it's us and God and thousands of other people walking alongside us. I want to come back to you talking about addiction, just to clarify to listeners, because I think some people might go, well, I don't have an addiction, so I can stop listening at this point.
Mm-hmm.
You're speaking to uh, any sort of habit that any of us have that we have difficulty letting go of. I mean, that's
Mm-hmm.
really what you're saying. And so in that context, we all have addictions. We can be addicted to a way of thinking. We can be addicted to a pattern of behavior, a way of, again, based on those core beliefs, a way of looking at ourselves and looking at people that we struggle to let go of. It doesn't have to be this tangible substance that we're using: drugs, alcohol, sex, sugar, entertainment, all the top 10. that people think of. Addiction is just, in this context, it's just simply, I have a way of doing things that is repetitive and I can't let go of it.
Right. If you look at an because even these things have all the hallmarks of those classic top addictions in terms of can
Yes.
you is this thing complicating or making your life harder, life for those around you harder?
Yeah.
Yes. Can you once you've identified it, can you just go, okay, I'm not going to do that anymore? If the answer to that is also no, then like there's like a wiring issue. It's these patterns of behavior will rewire our brain the same, not the same way, but similar to how a substance will. It doesn't create a physical need, and it doesn't manifest itself in the same way. But if you are someone who struggles with anger and then you have a moment where you're trying to control that anger, it might not feel like withdrawals the same way someone coming down from a heroin addiction it's going to be, but like there will be a physiological reaction to trying not to express that anger in the moment and try to control this addiction.
Sure.
It's these things we don't quite fully understand, but that drive our behavior, and we just
Yeah,
can't
right.
stop even when we
Well,
identify it.
let me give you a really simple example that I think a lot of people can relate to. People can be addicted to um, the natural narcotics that are flowing through the body during the in love experience. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So when you meet somebody and you are attracted to them and you have this connection, there are powerful chemicals flowing through the body. And then when you move from that phase of a relationship into reality setting in, and it's hard work, and all the things that I thought were so cute about you are kind of annoying now, and we don't have any real roots to this relationship, and we no longer think of ourselves as in love. The relationship ends and we're back to seeking that feeling that we felt in that beginning phase. And that can become an addiction. We can be constantly seeking out the chemical feeling of being in love without knowing how to be in a committed relationship. That's just one example of people just revolving door relationships because they're addicted to that feeling.
And the implicit belief, whether it's that or any other sort of addiction, is I will get the feeling I expect the next time.
Yeah,
There's always like a pursuit and a yearning. It's like that wasn't fulfilling. Even that when I did experience that, it eventually went away. The next one will be the one, right? The next drink, the next
the next
whatever
one will be the
sexual
one.
encounter, the next relationship,
Yes.
and there's always a hole to be filled um, on that front. So
Another really common one that I see is that we can be addicted to chaos and drama.
mhm.
And, I actually think this is an epidemic in our society that nice guys are being um, rejected by women because those women have been through so much turmoil in their relationships with men, maybe going all the way back to their father, that they don't know how to be with a nice guy who's kind and treats them with respect and is gentle. And it's boring.
Mhm.
It's boring to them. They are actually addicted to this cycle uh, of of drama and conflict.
Well, they confuse
It's so
intensity.
familiar. Yeah, the
Yeah.
intensity of the relationship. It doesn't feel good. They're complaining about it, but the absence of it feels so unfamiliar, so uncomfortable that it just in it that relationship just gets labeled as boring.
Yeah. It's the confusing of um, intensity with love and care. I mean,
Yes.
my favorite artist of all time is Jackson Brown, and he has a song "You Love the Thunder," and that's all about a
Yeah.
relationship where you'll take the things you don't
Yes.
like. You'll take the fact that you viscerally don't like the conflict, but what's revealed in the conflict, that passion, is the thing that you're looking for.
Right. And we can mistake, like, I've known people who've grown up with so much conflict at home. They were picked on by older siblings. They maybe the father wasn't in the home, very much. So there's the absence of a healthy father figure in the home. And I'm thinking of a woman when I give this example, she had to learn to fight for her rights in the home. She was really in some ways being abused by her siblings. And she repeated that pattern in her marriage, except that she married somebody who didn't want to fight. He
Hmm.
he wanted to love her. And she kept wanting to get him to fight with her
Hmm.
because that's what she ultimately respected. That she grew up
Hmm.
going, that, someone who fights with me is someone who cares, right? They're passionate. If they're fighting with me and I'm fighting back, then we really care about each other.
Hmm.
And now I'm married to this man who doesn't fight with me, and I keep trying to get him to fight with me. It must mean he doesn't love me.
Yeah.
So yes, so we can be addicted to patterns of behavior and things that have been normalized for us, again, that have affected those core beliefs about what love really is,
Mhm.
what a healthy relationship really looks like, that play out every day. And again, tying it all back in, affect the way that we communicate and interact with our fellow Christians, for
Yeah.
sure.
And that's what drives the issues in the church, is what drives the division and the misinterpretation, and it's interacting with yourself and other people who are going through this, and also potentially never actually finding out what's driving it. Like, a lot of it is just
Yeah.
they're going through it, I'm going through it. There are elements of myself I will die not really understanding, and the other person as well. And if it's just a brief interaction, um, I, we might not have the nature of a relationship where we're going to dig into it and come to some sort of resolution, but it's still up to both individuals involved to respond to that thing in a godly way,
Mhm.
when putting the emphasis on themselves. Like, this starts with me, and if both parties have that, it doesn't it matter what each party is going through, because that should win out. And hopefully over time, what it leads to is greater understanding, um, and peace within the community. But the the last thing I'd like to reference is what you called, and we touched on it a bit, in terms of this sense of fairness and justice.
Mhm.
But you referenced what's called the fairness fallacy. Could you talk about that a bit to end? I thought that
Sure.
was an interesting.
Yeah, sure. The fairness fallacy is one of these things that can really distort our thinking, and of course then ultimately the way that we interact with people. And it's just simply this belief that everything needs to be fair, um, and that if it's not fair, that um, I now have the right to either try to make it fair or be upset, with you because there's this inequity in what's going on. The reality is that life just isn't fair.
Mm-hmm.
If God treated us, if God gave to us what was fair, we'd all be dead,
Mm-hmm.
right? So
Yep.
God is more than fair to us, but life itself and the human existence is filled with inequity. I mean, starting from where you're born, what country you're born into. Some people have far more human rights than others. Some are born into very loving homes, some are not. Everybody's circumstances are different. And we have to learn to deal with the reality that what we have may be more or less than what somebody else has, and that's just how it is. And we have to stop making comparisons,
Mm-hmm.
because that's what it leads us to do. Is it starts, as children, you see this, right? Like, he got more than I did, that's
Mm-hmm.
not fair. He got to stay up later than me, that's not fair. And we have to learn as we mature. So what? You're going to go through a lot of unfair situations. Deal with it, get
Yeah.
over it. But it distorts our thinking a lot in the way that we see the world.
And what's so I guess the first thing that comes to mind for me is the antidote to that is mercy, right? Mercy and love.
Yeah,
Like, that's the,
yeah,
because we're not promised fairness in this life. God,
no,
at the end, God's justice is fair and takes mercy into account and all these things. But in this life, when that's an expectation, but absolutely not built into the system, I feel like the only thing you can exercise then is mercy and understanding. Um, but do you, maybe to conclude, do you have any uh, practical, in your experience as a counselor, practical steps to sort of maybe if there is a conflict happening, or if someone's in a crisis in terms of how they're viewing the group they're in, or just dealing with all these things, all these interpersonal conflicts, do you have sort of some practical steps people can take to put all this into perspective?
Absolutely, there are. Before you can, I would suggest that before you actually go to somebody and make assumptions, maybe even make accusations about things that you're not fully, in the know about, I would stop and I would do some inner reflection and I would go, what's the problem? What's the real problem? Sometimes the surface problem isn't the real problem. Why is this a problem? How is this impacting me? How is it impacting other people? What am I telling myself about this problem? Okay, so now we're identifying potentially our own distorted thinking. What how do I know that what I'm thinking is actually accurate? What am I basing that on? What am I feeling about this? And what do I need to have change? What change am I looking for? A lot of times we go to somebody or we react to somebody because we're hurt. The first thing we pay attention to is our emotion. And, oh, I can't believe they said or did that. And then we pull away and talk to everybody else about it except that person.
Mhm.
But if we just stop and sort of really reflect and go, why is this upsetting for me? What's really going on? Then we can begin to formulate what we want to say to that person. And the first thing that we want to do is we want to clarify what what actually even really was said or heard. This is what prevents assumptions. So we need to be able to go to that person and say, this is what I saw happening. This is what I heard said. This is the meaning I attached to it. I think I could be wrong, but I want to check in with you. Is that what you meant?
Mhm.
Or is what I saw what was really happening? Because it's possible that I got this wrong. When we clarify, we give the other person the opportunity to say, "Oh, I'm so sorry. No, that isn't what I intended at all." Or no, you only saw this part, but here's what else was going on. Clarifying changes our communication with people very quickly, right? Just simply saying, this is what I heard, this is what I saw. Is that what was intended? And now we can have a very different conversation with that person. I can't emphasize that enough. But too much of the time we walk away going, oh, I know.
Mhm.
I know what that meant. I know what they really were saying. I know what they were implying. And then off we go with that assumption and it takes us, down this, road of hurt and lack of forgiveness, et cetera, et cetera. And then that impacts and then we're busy talking, we're busy telling everybody how deeply we've been hurt and offended and then it blossoms. And I think the other part of clarification, I will share this. There have been times I feel this so strongly that it's even impacted me and Jeff at times. My husband is extremely intuitive, and I'm intuitive too, but he's even more intuitive than me. And sometimes we can get in trouble with our intuition, right? Because we will infer, because we're so intuitive people are so good at understanding the nuances behind people's words, right? But sometimes we can infer things incorrectly because we don't have the full context. So my husband will say to me about a situation, they said this and this is what's going on, and I will challenge him on it, and he'll get a little defensive with me, going, Debbie, you know I'm right, and I'll say, sweetie, you may be right, but we've both been on the receiving end of people inferring things about us that are inaccurate. And I don't want to do that.
Mhm.
So, how do you actually know that that's true? What tangible evidence do you have that that's actually true? And it circles back around to, okay, you're right, I don't, but that is such a problem, and we're all guilty of it, right? Somebody comes to us and says, have you heard what so and so did or didn't do? And we go, really? Wow,
Mhm.
I can't believe they did that. Instead of going, wait a second, how do we know that that's actually true?
Yeah.
Let's get some clarification on this situation. What's the factual evidence telling us about this situation? We don't do enough of that.
And it's people also confuse, is this more likely than not the case? That could be. Like your husband could be right. It might be more likely than not given the evidence, but like that still means there is a significant some chance that you are wrong. And so reserving judgment, the difference between knowing something dogmatically and going, well, that's more likely than not, right? It's like the difference in the legal system. The burden of proof is not, is it more likely than not the person did
Yeah.
it? No, it's like it's beyond a reasonable doubt. So
You,
it's
you, you know what I hear sometimes from people is, well, it came from a reliable source.
whatever that means.
Whatever that means. And so sometimes it's a reliable source because it's a friend,
Right.
right? And I trust my friend. My friend wouldn't lie. Well, right away we're in trouble, right? Because if our reliable source is just somebody that we like and we have a good relationship with, that doesn't lead us to any factual evidence. That
Yeah.
just means I have a tendency to believe somebody that I'm, on good terms with more
Right.
than somebody that I'm not. And so we're still back to square one. So I mean that's a long way to say don't assume anything. Don't assume that you know what's going on in a person's life and what has shaped them. Um, and and try to push past the surface of what you see to understand and comprehend where a person is coming from. If we worked all of us just a tiny bit harder at trying to understand the meaning behind instead of assuming that we know the meaning behind, we would have much better relationships with each other.
Awesome. Thanks, Debbie. I mean, that's a great place to end. I mean, you could have an entire podcast series just on this, just on interpersonal
Yes.
relationships and
Yeah.
reconciliation and how to navigate this because we deal with this and it doesn't. I guess it could get a little bit easier with tools and practice, but it just sort of stays hard until our time is come and we die. And
Yeah.
but it's also the main catalyst of our conversion, whether it's our kids or brethren or
Yeah.
or love interests. So really
Yeah.
appreciate you coming on. This has been great for me. I hope it's valuable for everyone listening. This is really important stuff.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure. And I mean, I love talking about this stuff. I do it all day long and it never gets old. So
That's awesome. Love the passion.
thanks, Daniel.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, thanks for joining us, everybody. We'll see you again next time.